Hoy vamos a conversar con Gabriel Jackson, el autor de...
Today we are going to talk to Gabriel Jackson, the author of this book called The Spanish Republic and the Civil War, which according to the opinion of many critics who have studied it is the most complete summary published to date of that interesting period in Spanish life. Gabriel Jackson was born in Mount Vernon, New York, on March 10, 1921. I believe you finished this famous story around 1962. Or rather 1964, but it would not be authorized in Spain until 1976. That is true. Which means that from the first edition to the last you had the opportunity to use new data, to have access to new sources and to correct, expand and modify some of the data you had previously published in your story. For example, with regard to two very specific topics. One, the foreign aid received by both sides in the conflict, and the other, the number of victims caused by the conflict. Before we move on to the rest, could you tell us about the latest data that you know? For example, regarding foreign aid, did Franco receive the same aid as the Republic and vice versa, or was there a greater military potential for one of the two sides? I think that the question is still difficult to answer completely. From a financial point of view, it seems that both sides received more or less similar aid, but Franco's aid arrived much more regularly and the quality of spare parts and supplies was much better on the nationalist side. At the same time, in the latest edition, and I have said that there were certainly more Russian planes and probably tanks than I had mentioned in the first edition, overall, aid was much stronger on General Franco's side. But from a financial point of view, you said that there was a certain leveling out, a balance. In other words, the investment in billions of dollars was similar on one side as on the other. Investment, it is not about. The gold reserves of the Bank of Spain and the use of this gold by the Russians. Not only for Russian weapons, but in Europe in general. And it is only a coincidence that the total price of German and Italian aid to Franco is more or less similar. Hey, have historians like you ever had access to the accounts that the Russians have made? And the thing is, they have made them with respect to Spanish gold. The Russians have not said anything except for the fact that the value was exhausted by their aid. I don't know whether to believe it or not, but there is no data whatsoever to support that assertion. Do you think they will ever open up? Maybe one day, for sure the French through the Russians, I don't know. The advantages that it had, especially on the nationalist side, were in terms of more or less regular and immediate supplies, both via Portugal.
Yes?
And by what other routes? Well, to Cadiz, right? By the nationalists by ship, but by ship.
And the Italians too. Mediterranean.
And regarding the dominance or supremacy in the air, which seems to have been in the hands of the nationalist army for most of the war, were there more planes on Franco's side? Or were they also more homogeneous? Not more in numbers, but more in armament, more in quality. Many of the planes on the Republican side were 20 years old.
había problemas con la parabrisa que
There were problems with the
aceite,
windshield, oil, or else the elite had been shot and things of
los
that type.
fusilamientos han pasado por el élite, cosas de este tipo. Mientras que al lado
Whereas on the
nacional,
nationalist side, the
aviones
German and Italian planes were in very good operating condition.
condiciones de operación. Se puede especificar con bastante facilidad
It is
los
possible to specify quite easily the small moments of Republican dominance in the months of November to January or
los
February
meses
in the
de
defense of Madrid.
noviembre hasta enero o febrero a la defensa de Madrid.
November 1936. Yes.
Y después los 2 o 3 primeros días de la
And then the
batalla
first
de
2 or 3
Brunete
days of the Battle of Brunet and the Battle of Teruel and the Battle of El Hebro. The rest of the war was almost unchallenged supremacy on the part of the nationalists.
Casi sin desafío de la parte de los nacionales.
Desde el punto de vista de los países que
From the
ayudaron
point of
a
view of the
uno
countries
y
that
otro
helped both
bando
sides in the fight,
lucha,
it is established that Franco was helped mainly by the Italians and the Germans.
Fundamentalmente los italianos y los alemanes,
Yes, and the Portuguese, and
los portugueses, y a la República
the Russians exclusively helped the Republic.
exclusivamente.
Well,
Pues
Mexico
con una voluntad
was willing
de
to help,
ayuda,
but the
pero
aid was of
ayuda
no
con
military
poca
importance.
importancia militar.
Y en cuanto a hombres,
And in terms of men, since there were foreign combatants on both sides, do you think the number was also higher on Franco's side?
¿fue también superior en el lado de Franco?
Eso
That can
también
also
se
be
puede
specified.
especificar. Había,
There were
70,000
70,000 Italians, 10,000 Germans, 80,000 Moors.
80,000 moros, yo creo los moros
I believe the
son
Moors are
extranjeros
foreigners in
de
this situation, and
circulación,
between
y entre más o menos 20 a 30,000 extranjeros
20 and
en
30,000
las
foreigners in the
brigadas
international
nacionales,
brigades and 2,000
y
Russian technicians,
2,000
pilots, and
técnicos,
advisors.
pilotos, consejeros rusos. Hay otra cosa a decir en este de ayuda internacional.
There is another thing to say about international aid, financial aid, and oil and trucks from the capitalist world of England and the United States.
Del mundo capitalista de Inglaterra y los Estados Unidos también. Sin
Also,
fanfarrón,
without
sin
fanfare,
publicidad,
without
pero
publicity,
esto
but this
era
was
una
quite an
ayuda
important aid and it
bastante
gave Franco the
importante.
opportunity
Y
to.
ha dado a Franco la ocasión de ser independiente un poco
Be
de
somewhat
los
independent
alemanes,
from the Germans because he
porque
also had
tuvo
American trucks and oil.
camiones y petróleos americanos también.
Entonces el famoso juego de las
So, the famous game of the
occidentales
Western European
europeas
democracies that claim to be on the side of the Republic and instead were supplying fuel to Franco is somewhat contradictory.
Es un tanto contradictorio.
Era un poco de
This whole
comedia,
intervention
esto
committee
de
thing
la-
was a bit of a comedy.
de non intervención, sí.
Well, let's move on to the other issue, which is also a subject about which there has been much speculation. You know that it has been going on since the famous figure of 1 million dead in the Spanish War. Then there was talk of 500,000 and it seemed that historians were satisfied with that figure. However, the latest data that has been made public and that you reveal and even cite the sources from which they come, seems to state that on the battlefields, that is, in purely military actions, there were no more than 100 to 125,000 dead. That is my opinion. Yes, it is not completely proven, but the proportion of deaths that would be normal for such and such type of action and the number of soldiers on both sides, etc. Yes, I would say between 100,000 and 10,025. You say, among other things, that the fiercest battle, the one that cost the most lives, the one that was truly a battle of profound attrition, was the Battle of the Ebro. That was the most costly in terms of lives for the country.
For sure, yes.
And then, which were the most serious, the hardest and fiercest? The Battle of Brunet lasted for a few days, but only a few days.
Y claro, la Batalla de Madrid,
And of course, the Battle of Madrid in November 1936. But from a military point of view, the concentration of artillery planes meter by meter above the ground.
metro por metro sobre la tierra. En este sentido, la batalla del
In this
Ebro,
sense,
en la
the Battle of the
opinión de
Ebro,
los
in the opinion of
expertos
military
militares,
experts, was the
era la
only
sola
battle comparable
batalla
to the great battles of the
comparable
First
con
World
las
War in
grandes
France.
batallas de la Primera Guerra en Francia.
Era una batalla
It was a battle planned
planteada
strategically to achieve the total
estratégicamente
destruction
como
of the
para
enemy.
conseguir la destrucción total del enemigo.
On both
Sí,
sides,
Ambas
desgaste en este sentido, pero creo que Negrín y General Rojo han
attrition
montado
in
la
this sense,
ofensiva
but I believe that
con
Negrin
un-
and General
con un
Rojo
fin
mounted the
diplomático
offensive with a diplomatic aim,
para
to
dar
demonstrate the moral
evidencia de la
strength of the
fuerza
Republic and
de
to
la
convince,
moral
if
de la
possible, the French and
República y
English
para
of their interest in
convencer,
helping the
si
Republic.
posible, a los franceses y ingleses de su interés para ayudar a la República. En este sentido, ha
In this sense,
fracasado,
it failed,
sobre
above
todo
all,
a
because of the
causa
Munich
del
Pact at the
Pacto
end of
de
September
Múnich de
1938.
fines de septiembre del año 38.
¿Cree usted que en esos tiempos,
Do you think that
cuando
at that
se
time,
desata la
when the Ebro
ofensiva del
offensive was
Ebro,
unleashed,
ya
there were
hay
already
quien
those
está
who were already
pensando en
thinking
la
about the possibility of a
posibilidad de
negotiation,
una
of an agreed
negociación,
end?
de un final pactado?
Sí, yo creo que Negrín desde el primer momento de hacerse
Yes, I believe that Nin, from the first moment he became president of the government, thought about a mediated peace, but he always thought that the military strength of the Republic had to be demonstrated in order to achieve a deal.
Demostrar la fuerza militar de la República para conseguir un negocio.
Do you think that what Negrin meant with his famous slogan, "To resist is to win," was precisely that?
A lo menos
At least to resist in order to
para
avoid the worst.
evitar lo peor.
Volviendo a las bajas de nuestra guerra.
Returning to the casualties of our war, you mention other figures that are around 10,000 people who died in both zones as a result of the aerial bombings.
Por efecto de los bombardeos aéreos.
Yes,
Those figures are corroborated in the archives.
Eso es una
That is an
estimación
estimate
a
based on
través
press
de
reports and
prensa
censuses,
y
but it does not
pero no es cosa probada.
Parece que la desnutrición,
seem that
la falta de
malnutrition,
alimentos
lack of
y
food
las
and diseases
enfermedades
caused by that
ocasionadas
same
por la
malnutrition had a really significant
tuvieron una
impact on
incidencia
demographics.
realmente importante en la demografía. Usted habla de más de
You mentioned more than
50.000 muertos.
50,000 dead, which is
Es
almost
casi la
half of the
mitad
deaths that
de los
occurred in
muertos
battles
que hubo
on the
en las
battlefront.
en el frente de batalla.
50,000 muertos
Deaths
de
from diseases
enfermedades.
and malnutrition.
O de-
Oh,
Ah,
of course,
claro, sí,
diseases and
Enfermedades y
malnutrition.
desnutrición.
Both
Ambos
concepts are
conceptos están
included.
englobados
In a minimum of
en un mínimo de
50,000 and a
50,000
maximum
y
of
un máximo de
50,000.
50,000.
I don't think the
La cifra
figure
no se
changes.
altera.
Porque
Yes,
había
because there was
un
terrible hunger,
hambre
especially in the
terrible,
Republican
sobre todo
zone,
en la zona
which was the urbanized
republicana,
area.
era la zona urbanizada, pero no la zona agrícola. En
But
el
not the
año
agricultural zone in the year 38, and according to the Quakers and the International Red Cross, there were quite a few deaths from malnutrition.
Había bastante muertos de desnutrición.
Y el resto de
And the
las
rest of the
víctimas
victims,
hasta un
up to a total of
350,000,
350,000, which fluctuates from that minimum to a maximum of 400 or 405,000. You attribute this to political reprisals and executions in both zones. Yes, but you attribute a figure of 20,000 to the Republican zone and between 150,000 and 200,000 to the nationalist zone. And then you say that these figures correspond mainly to the trials after the war, right?
Durante y después,
Durante
pero
y
ha
después.
continuado
During and
a
after,
lo
but it
menos
continued at
al
least
año
until the
40.
year 44. Do you think these figures are fairly accurate?
Que hoy responden de una manera bastante aproximada
Today?
a la realidad.
I
Yo
think
creo
so.
que sí. He leído un artículo por
I read an
Eduardo
article by
Guzmán en
Eduardo de
Tiempo
Guzman in Tiempo de Historia
diciendo,
saying, giving higher
dando
figures than mine.
figuras más altas que los míos.
And
Y yo veo también que en la tercera
I also see that in the third
edición,
edition
su
of your
libro
book,
Hamas
Hamas is now
próximo
approaching the figures I have
ahora
given.
a las, figuras que yo he dado.
Y hay alguna idea
And there is also
aproximada
some
también
approximate idea about the
acerca de
invalids, the
los
mutilated people
inválidos,
left
de
by
los
the war in
mutilados
both
que dejó la
Spains.
guerra en ambas Españas.
Eso no
I don't know about that. I haven't studied the numbers, have I? Well,
Yo
I would
quisiera
also like to
preguntarle
ask you
también
if
si se conoce de alguna manera el número aproximado de españoles
the approximate
que se
number of
vieron
Spaniards who were
forzados
forced to leave the
a
country,
abandonar el
to go
país,
into exile,
a exiliarse,
establishing their second homeland,
eligiendo
first in
su
Europe, later in Latin America,
segunda
etc., is
patria,
known in
primero
some
en
way.
Europa, más tarde en Hispanoamérica, etcétera. ¿Usted
Do
tiene
you
una
have an
idea
approximate
aproximada,
idea,
según
according
se
to your
escribe,
studies,
cuántos
of how many
exiliados
exiles were produced?
produjo la
Según la
derrota?
policía francesa,
According to the
más
French
o
police,
menos
more or less
300,000
300,000 people
personas
crossed the border
han
in February
atravesado la
1939.
frontera en febrero del año 39. Tal vez 100,000 han vuelto
Perhaps
en España,
100,000 returned to Spain within a year and the rest a few thousand to
y
Mexico.
el resto, algunos miles a México, la mayoría en Francia.
The majority in France. There are perhaps 200,000 Spaniards now and their children in France.
La República Española del 14 de abril que usted
The Spanish
historia
Republic of
para
April
que
14th,
pueda
which you describe so
comprenderse
that it can be understood,
si es que una guerra
if
puede
a war can
entenderse,
ever be
puede ser,
understood,
para que pueda
but so that it can be
comprenderse qué es
understood
lo
what
que
led to
llevó
that armed
a que ese
conflict,
enfrentamiento
raises very,
bélico se
very
produjera,
questions, and you try to answer some of
plantea
those
interrogantes
questions.
muy variados y usted trata de responder a algunas de esas preguntas. Se dice, por ejemplo,
It is said,
que
for
la
example, that the
República
Spanish Republic
Española
was born as the result of a
nació
Masonic
como fruto de
conspiracy.
una conjura masónica. ¿Qué
What chances of truth can be given to that statement, which is already old? It is completely exaggerated. I believe that the only role of Freemasonry is the fact that many of the leaders of small Republican parties and some, not many, but some of the socialists were Freemasons. It was a fraternal relationship and in addition to their political commitments. But that is all. How do you explain that the Republic lost the war? That is another question that people continue to ask themselves, especially outside our country. Why did the war end? Firstly, it was due to the much more effective aid to the nationalists and the professional quality, the single command on the national side. There was a sense of discipline. They accepted the hierarchy, while in the Republican zone there were political struggles throughout the war. I believe these two things explain the loss of the war. This ongoing dissent, this internal war of some against others. Do you think that, this disintegration, the lack of unity? Yes. It was very important. Of course, for many people in the Republican zone the war was not worth it except to achieve certain very important reforms, while in the nationalist zone it was to protect the things achieved, to protect property and the law and order as it existed. Do you think the Spanish War could have been avoided? Yes, well, if it is legitimate to hypothesize, I think they could have avoided it. Yes. After all, it began with a military uprising. A military uprising is not inevitable. There is one more thing. If the Republic had won the war, considering this hypothetical level, what could have happened? What kind of victory would that have been? And what kind of regime? What would the Spanish have inherited from that victory? I would say that the only way to win the war on the side of the Republic would have been with the help and collaboration of Western democracies. In this case, I suppose that the result would have been more or less like in France and Italy as a result of World War II, a form of democracy, more or less parliamentary or perhaps more presidential, but of this type, I think. What happens is that our war was immediately followed by the World War, and one also does not know to what extent the victory of the Republic could have triggered an advance on that war. Perhaps before September 1939 Hitler would have launched his offensive, so it seems improbable in the hypothetical realm that the Republic could have survived peacefully. Don't you think? I
Think you're right. Yes, there.
is something else I would also like to ask you about. What did the war solve in terms of Spain's traditional problems? Wars solve things. Some wars solve things.
Yo creo que no ha solucionado nada la guerra, pero
I don't think the war solved anything, but fortunately the economic development of Europe and the rise of tourism and democratic capitalism, etc., solved many things for Spain in the 60s.
etcétera, ha arreglado muchas cosas por España en los años 60.
But the war itself didn't. War is always an evil, a damage that should be avoided as much as possible, don't you think? But there are wars like the Civil War in England in the 10th century, or the French Revolution. There are wars in which important things are achieved, but I think the victorious cause in your Civil War was a completely negative cause. Have you met some of the protagonists of our Civil War? Did you have to interview many of them to hear and learn their testimonies? Yes, I knew Prieto, General Rojo, General Kinderen quite well, but most of my interviews were with people from the middle classes. Y esto de propósito, porque pensaba siempre que un jefe quiere defender. And this is on purpose because I always thought that when a leader wants to defend his position before the story, he would probably be more honest or less interested in the testimonies of lesser-known people. So you have spoken mainly with officers, I suppose, captains, lieutenants, even soldiers. Even soldiers, yes, from both sides, because I met many people from the Republic during my student days at the University of Toulouse in France. And later you met them again sooner or later in Mexico. No. Not many in Mexico, right? Most of them in France. Our historian is descended from Germans from the family of Gabriel Jackson. His name was not originally Jackson, his last name was Schuberstein. And as I understand it, the Schubersteins were musical instrument manufacturers in Berlin. That's
right.
I believe there are still violins with the Schuberstein brand in the Berlin State Opera Orchestra. At least 20 years ago. Yes, yes. His grandfather, however, apparently for whatever reason, decided one day to emigrate. Yes, well, he was also Jewish, and the Bismarck laws were a bad luck for the Jews. So he left for the United States around 1880 and settled in New York. In New York, he ran a general store. A general store. What they call in some American countries an abastos.
Yes, abastos. Yes.
What they call in Catalonia a colmado, etc. The store, I think, was in that suburban district that movies and news reports have made famous because it's where the defeated and beaten men go in the Bowery, right? In Bowery. Where the fighting was not easy. Life was a life of constant harassment. By gangs of criminals. That's right. And most of the businessmen paid these criminals for protection, and it seems that my great-grandfather protected his own store with his bare fists, and this was less than 20 years after our Civil War.
después de nuestra guerra civil, uno de los grandes
One of the great heroes of that war was Stonewall Jackson, general of the cavalry.
Sí, caballería. Pues, mi
Well,
bisabuelo
my
era
great-grandfather was
Tildato
Tildato Jackson, and the family came from Germany and later took on this name.
han tomado este nombre.
Era tan bravo
My
el
grandfather
abuelo
was
que
so
se
fierce that he
defendía por
defended
sí solo
himself
contra
against the
las
gangs
bandas
and
y
didn't pay a
pagaba
single
ni un solo
dollar
dólar
for what they
de eso que
euphemistically
llaman
call protection.
eufemísticamente protección. De manera que los propios gángsters
So the gangsters in the neighborhood began to call him Little Jackson, and that's how the whole family stayed called
y así
Jackson.
quedaron en Jackson luego toda la familia.
Well, from his father.
El padre de Gabriel
Gabriel's father left a few
se
years
marcha
later.
unos años más tarde.
He was very young.
Niño, me
I think
parece
he
que
was
tenía
2 or
2
3
años
years old.
después.
And he
Y
also
se
went to
instala
work,
también
I
a
think as a
trabajar
watchmaker.
de relojero,
That's an apprentice.
de
But as an
aprendiz de
apprentice
relojero al
watchmaker,
mismo
but at the
tiempo,
same time he spent the night going to those night schools, I think they're free, that they have in the United States.
Estados Unidos, donde con
Where with real
verdadero
effort,
mientras
while
trabajaba
working all day,
día,
he earned his
consiguió
engineering
el
degree.
título de ingeniero.
That's
It.
He was a determined man. He was also a transportation engineer.
¿Qué
What
podría
can you
usted
tell us that you
decirnos
got from
que
your
ha
father?
recibido de su padre? ¿Qué
What
cosas
aspects of your father do
hay
you have in
de su
you?
padre?
Pues, la música
Well, music and a
y
love of
el
literature.
amor por la literatura. Yo conozco bien el alemán porque
I
mi
know
padre
German well because
siempre
my father has always
estudiado
maintained his interest and, I believe, his love
y
for
creo
democracy.
también el amor hacia la democracia. Mi padre ha
My
trabajado
father has worked
bastante en
extensively
otros
in other
países,
countries and has always
ha
admired
ayudado
England.
siempre a Inglaterra. Me ha dicho, me acuerdo como chico, mi padre diciendo,
He told me, I remember my father saying when he was a child, that a country with a police force that doesn't have rifles was like a miracle to him, especially with the bad memories of Germany before the First World War. You were 2 brothers, right?
2 brothers. Is.
Your brother older or younger? He's an older one and he's a librarian and professor of bibliographic methods. I think he's also an expert in languages. He knows more languages than you do, much more than I do. He knows all the Slavic languages, as well as Latin and German. Yes. Where is he now? He's at K-State University in Ohio, which is one of the most important libraries in this regard. Apart from your primary studies, you studied at Harvard University,
Yes. That's.
where you did your humanities training,
Yes.
and where you won the prize for history and literature in 1941. Yes. And your degree with magna cum laude. Yes. So you were what is called a brilliant student. Because your vocational interests were directed towards several paths. On the one hand, music, which you loved because you had seen it so much within the school and family environment. On the other hand, literature. Yes, and history. How did history appear? As a specialty in literature, or how did history appear in your life? Well, I had a so-called concentration camp. It's a phrase with other uses, but a concentration camp within the University for History and Literature. But when it came to choosing doctoral studies, I preferred history, because a doctorate in literature is about literary criticism. That didn't interest me that much, but I wrote a novel that they're going to publish here in a few months, and I've always divided my time. I've always thought that history and literature, music and cultural history, are my thing. I understand, although it doesn't appear on your resume, that you spent a few months, a few long months studying in Spain, in Barcelona. In Spain, with that, it was around the 40s. No, in 1951. In 1951. Yes, yes, when I was getting my doctorate in Toulouse, I was introduced to Professor Vicente Vives, who helped me a lot. Did you study with him for a few months? No.
No.
No, I didn't know him from time to time, but he didn't study.
No, no.
No.
El gran
My great professor for my doctorate was Pierre Vilar. Ah, Pierre Vilar. But you were interested in Vikings Vives because I think he was one of the most interesting figures in modern history that this country has produced, especially at that time. He was number one, I mean, he was the most advanced, don't you think? I think so, especially because of the methods. The methodology that he had applied to the study and understanding, to the analysis of history. Yes. And he was a brilliant and very energetic man with a great character. The truth is that when you first came into contact with Spanish culture, it was in another country that was very close to ours, which was Mexico in 1942, when you traveled on a scholarship. A 2 or 3 month scholarship, right? That's
Right.
You hadn't heard Spanish spoken until then. No, I didn't learn French, German, or Latin at that time, but Spanish was something new. What did Mexico mean to you?
Tuve pensión con españoles y la mayoría de gente que he conocido eran españoles.
I had a boarding school with Spaniards and most of the people I met were Spanish, but of course, I was particularly interested in the anthropology and art of the Indians, and the cultural fusion between the Castilians and the Indians, very different from what happened in the United States.
Los castellanos y los indianos, muy diferente de lo que ha pasado en los Estados Unidos.
That miscegenation, that product of miscegenation,
That.
mixture of Indo-American and Spanish cultures. Yes. And biological mixing too, and biological mixing. That mixture of races that has produced truly wonderful products, don't you think? Yes, in my opinion, yes. Well, and there in Mexico you also met, of course, with those Spaniards, you met the defeated in our Civil War and that's where you got to know. More directly the Spanish drama that ended up fascinating you, right? Yes, that's right. My great interest in the history of the Republic and the war surely comes from this experience in Mexico. Then World War II came. And as an American citizen you had to enlist.
Of course. And where were you?
Well, I was a cartographer. Cartographer, yes. In the Pacific, I made maps of the beaches of Sapin and other islands there. For the famous Pacific campaign, the Philippines and all that. Yes, yes. That's why I made the maps in my book The Republic and also Medieval Spain. I like making maps. After World War II, you spent, I think, about 10 important years of your life exercising another of your more or less permanent multiple vocations, which is music. We found you at that time as a chamber music instructor and as a choir director, the Padney School Choir at God College, right? Yes, yes, yes. Well, music was always a second job, that is to say, you were primarily a language and history teacher, but always to earn a little extra money or to have a vacation. Because there are summer camps for musicians in the United States, and as a flutist and as an instructor I had my expenses paid for a vacation. In this way, you are also a flutist.
Yes, yes.
But you have multiple skills. Don't you? It is also the instrument that I play. In 1965, you were a professor of humanities at the University of San Diego in California. There you teach philosophy, European history, literature, etc., right? Yes, yes, excuse me, it is the University of California in San Diego, because there is another university, right? In the state called the University of San Diego, right? The University of California, San Diego, San Diego.
In San Diego.
What I don't know is when you got married. I have no idea about that. When did you meet your wife and how do I know you have 2 daughters? Yes. And there's a photo somewhere where we see, there you are. There you are with your wife and your two girls.
Sí. Esto es una fotografía a un meeting de
Yes,
padres
this is a
y
photo from a parent,
maestros
teacher,
y
and child meeting at
hijos
school,
en la
which is
escuela.
something that happens
Cosa que
quite often
ocurre
and has a
con
certain
bastante
sentimental value
frecuencia
as you
y
see with your
tiene
heart.
un cierto valor sentimental como se ve con el corazón.
Now those girls are grown up. The oldest, Katerina, is 26 years old and is an agricultural engineer.
Yes.
The youngest is 24.
Yes. What's her
Name?
Yes, Rachel.
Raquel. And she works for a yacht builder. Yes.
Sí.
Yes, she.
Does a bit of everything when it comes to building yachts. She got into motorboating. Yes. And you met your wife in the countryside, also, at the PNY school.
Sí, sí. Era
He was a
instructor
math instructor at that time,
en esta época.
so he was also involved in teaching.
Sí.
Yes,
Pero es
but she's a professor of
de
French
literatura
literature.
francesa. Ha hecho su
He did his
propio
own doctorate at the
doctorado
same time we were in
cuando
France.
estábamos en Francia.
Earlier you were telling us about a novel that will be published in a few weeks here in Spain. The title I have written down is in that almost forgotten and silent yesterday.
Yes.
A curious title, isn't it?
Es el primer línea de un
It's the
gran
first line of a
poema
great poem by Karl
Karl
Esberg on issues of
sobre
social
cuestiones
justice.
de justicia social.
In the folded and quiet yesterdays. This line is very beautiful in English. I like the translation too, but it's also a very nice translation. This reminds me of something completely unrelated and that I shouldn't mention here, but I remember that in New York, walking down some street or other, a bar caught my attention. It had a very large sign on the door that said, "No radio or television, like in the happy old days." Oh, well, yes, a bit of that, that's part of the humor.
Yes.
I think this novel is related to the years of McCarthyism, the witch hunts, etc., right? Yes, it's a political trial. The hero is a Spanish refugee who illegally immigrated to the United States. He is condemned to the basis of entirely circumstantial evidence, something that unfortunately happens quite frequently in times of political prejudice. I would like you to tell us how long it took you to write this thick volume after having documented, classified, and organized all this material until it gave it the definitive form of the book. During the years 1955 to 1960, when I was at Wellesley College, I went to Harvard every week to get as many books as possible. Then I spent a year in Spain in the newspaper libraries and for interviews, and then a full year to write the book. As far as I know, it has been translated into Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese.
Of course.
And it also received an award, the Herbert Baxter Adams Award from the American Historical Association. Yes, sir. Are you really very satisfied with this book? This book has been your calling card to the entire world. Yes, that's true. I had never anticipated its success, its importance in Spain, but certainly for my professional life, it was very important. The book has received very good reviews, but it has also had some detractors, some who do not disagree with it, who do not agree. For example, Noam Chomsky. What do you think of what Chomsky says about the book? Well, Chomsky sympathizes very strongly with the anarchists and says that I have not paid enough attention to their role. Honestly, I cannot take his criticism seriously because it is very negligent. He says that I have not used certain sources and these same sources are in the bibliography and are the basis of my discussion. But of course, I have drawn different conclusions about the significance of the anarchists. There are other historians, among the many who have dedicated themselves to the partial rather than the global study of our war. A few moments ago you mentioned Thomas, who is the author of perhaps the first volume published with a certain eclectic spirit of balance and objectivity. What do you think of Thomas's work? Well, in the third edition, the critical edition by Grijalbo, I think it's a very important book with dates, facts. There's no other single book with so much information, but the previous editions were full of errors. What do you think of the Salas Larrazabal brothers as historians of this entire period? They are military historians with a very fixed point of view on the significance of the war. For example, what do you think of Julian Zugazagoia's book? I think it's a masterpiece of history as experienced by participants, of which there are so many books because I think there are hundreds of memoirs of participants in the war. Yes, but he's a talented man and experienced as a journalist, and he wrote Without Rancor in 1939. It's almost a miracle. Stanley Payne. Stanley Payne, very important in research, especially military research, his book on the military in Spain.
Gerald Brennan.
I really like Gerald Brennan for the flavor, for the sensitivity to Spain. Joaquin Araras. Oh, excuse me. I don't like this book at all. Gibson. Ian Gibson, yes, a fundamental work for understanding what happened in Granada in general, not just in the case of Garcia Lorca. What, apart from your own, is the best book written about the Spanish War for you? I would say Julio's book, who, as all our viewers probably know, was the director of widely circulated newspapers in Spain. I think the last one he directed was La Voz de Madrid, right? I think he was the socialist one too, but I think he had directed both La Voz and El Socialista. After this book, we have to mention another one that appeared in 1969 that unfortunately is out of print and we can't present it here, since it's the historian's research. In the year 74, this other one appeared in Spain, The Evolution or Introduction to Medieval Spain. In this work, Gabriel Jackson addresses the issue of the coexistence of three cultures and three religions, Hebrew, Arabic and Christian, for more than 700 years, which, according to Mr. Jackson, is undoubtedly a unique experience in universal history, in the history of culture. It is true, there is no other example of Jewish and Christian coexistence. There is no other. And what conclusions do you draw from this curious phenomenon? Well, there was a fairly intelligent and not so oppressive conquest to begin with, and then 8 centuries of forced coexistence. If you have to live with people, they learn to do it. The following book, 1974, was titled in its first edition A Concise History of the Spanish Civil War, year 74. It was later published by Rudo Iberico, as you can see here in Spanish and also in French. We could say that this is intended to be a synthesis of the entire great historical study that is the large volume that we have presented, and mainly of the War of Little over the Republic.
Exactly, I
wrote it because in the United States there is no room for a long book about the Republic and the war, and I have been invited to write something short. There is another book, this one called Costa Hazaña, The Popular Front and Other Essays, published by Ediciones Turner, which includes the writings that he has been publishing on Spanish topics in recent years. It contains his personal vision on topics of our recent history, including Costa Hazaña, the origins of anarchism, collectivizations during the Spanish Civil War, etc. You speak of these collectivizations as perhaps the most advanced social phenomenon that has occurred in modern history. The most advanced, one of the most advanced. But in any case, the most important social revolution in Spain since the Middle Ages. Then there are anthologies, the Spanish Civil War, Domestic Crisis, and International Conspiracy. There is another one published in the New York Times book, The Spanish Civil War, in 1972. And then, he published numerous other articles, apart from those collected in this volume. Costa Hazaña, The Popular Front and Other Essays, such as The Franco Era in Historical Perspective, The Spanish Popular Front, The Historical Contribution of Vicens Vives, The Student Rebellion, etc. I don't know. Let's complete a bit before returning to the main topic, Gabriel Jackson's resume. In addition to the awards already mentioned, he holds a bachelor's degree from Stanford, 1950, a doctorate from the University of Tulum in 1952, a big scholarship from the Social Sciences Research Council, 6,061, another full big scholarship to Spain, 6,162, another scholarship from the American Board of Education in 6,768, and later, in his teaching work, he has been at God College, Wellesley College, Knox College, and the University of California at San Diego, where he has held the following positions: Chairman of the Department of History, Chairman of the Faculty Senate, the Budget Committee, and Chairman of the Library Committee. He has also been a manuscript reader for university presses in California, Princeton, and Indiana, a consultant to the Hispanic Foundation of the Library of Congress on acquisitions in the field of Spanish history, supervisor and contributor to the revision of the Encyclopedia Americana, a seminar on the Spanish Republic at Clark's University, a seminar on Latin America at Harvard, presentation on documents from the United States and the Spanish Civil War at the American Historians Convention, lectures at the Universities of Madrid and Barcelona, and colloquia on the Civil War at York University. Visiting professor at the Complutense University of Madrid. He has also recently studied the document on Eurocommunism and the Communist Party of Spain. He is on the Fulbright Commission for the Committee on Scholarships to Study in Spain. And there is something else that caught my attention. He is president of Open Housing.
Yes.
What is open housing? Well, as you know, in the United States there is a lot of prejudice against blacks and also against people of color from Mexico, China, and Korea. And I have been an activist for years in the effort to completely free up the possibilities of renting or buying homes. Without prejudice or distinctions based on race.
You are giving a course in Madrid as a visiting professor on the subject of the Spanish Civil War. Your students are around 18 or 20 years old.
No, more like 25 or 30 years old. Between 25 and 30, they're already getting their doctorates. And more or less, what kind of curiosity do you notice about this topic? Well, almost all the questions are about the left. There's a phenomenal interest in the Trotskyists, in the PUM, in everything that happened on the left during the war. And, naturally, they're mostly men, or there are also many women. And generally speaking, looking at the current reality of the country in this pre-democratic moment that we're living, what would you say is the position of these young people? They're excited, they're expectant. Yes, compared to my visit in 1975, I would say that they're quite depoliticized and I suppose a little disillusioned, and I feel that. I think there's too much impatience. It takes time to build a democracy and there are boring things that have to be done. We Spaniards are impatient, that's true. From experience, yes. Finally, I would like to ask you, if it seems right to you and based on what you have come to know about them, for your brief opinion on some of the figures who are mentioned most often in the pages of your book. These figures who, in different roles, have played a leading role in history from 1931 to 1939, and some of them much later as well. For example, I would say that Azanio was the brains and builder of the Republic during the first 2 years, and then he was the president torn apart by the suffering and passions of the Civil War. Vistero. The Marxist theoretical brain of the Socialist Party and also a man of great ethical strength, his loyalty to the people of Madrid. There were times when he would completely escape the war, but he has remained in Madrid on purpose. José Calvacello, A.
Very strong and right-wing man, also very admirable for the founding of CAMPSA and his work with Primo de Rivera's father. José María Gil Robles.
The top leader of the Confederation of Autonomous Rights, a man who tried to balance between monarchists and moderates. Lister, who defended the people from the Republicans. The contractor of tranquility, and a man of bad luck during the Republic, has deserved a better reputation than two generals. Done. Mola, very clever and unfortunately in the first months of the war with a terrible hatred that is seen through his letters and orders. And I, no. Moscardo less, but of course, the hero of the defense of the Alcazar, he seems to me very much like a Boy Scout in temperament. And on the other side, Mia. Oh, of course, the symbol man, the accessible myth. In Zugafagea's phrase, the top leader of the defense of Madrid. Negrin, A. Socialist man, but not a Marxist, a man of great executive talent. Who has tried to create conditions for a negotiated peace, but who has failed in this regard. Largo Caballero. The most important man of the Spanish people, in the sense that he was the first prime minister who was a worker, and I believe that until now he alone, not only for Spain, but for all the countries of Europe. José Antonio, Primo de Rivera, A. Very gallant man and very, very broad in his sympathies. Indalecio Brio. The brains of the Socialist Party in Parliament and the great defense minister in the best days of the Republic at war. I don't want to keep reciting names because this could take all night. Thank you very much for having lent yourself to this game of improvisation that is always painful and difficult. And I would like to ask you to say goodbye. What are you doing now? What do you work on? What do you research?
Estoy haciendo una investigación de la carrera
I am doing
del
research on the
Dr.
career of Dr. Josep Truda as head of services at the San Pablo Hospital and his political and cultural activities in Catalonia.
Su actuación política y cultural en Cataluña.
That will be your next book. A book, an article. But the next book will be
Another novel.
another novel.
Como ven ustedes, Gabriel Jackson es hombre que no solamente
As you can see, Gabriel Jackson is a man who is not only capable of writing such a complete summary of the history of the Spanish Republic and the Civil War as he is of conducting a choir in an American school, or giving us a flute concert, or writing a novel that we await with the same curiosity.
darnos un concierto de flauta o de escribir una novela que esperamos con la misma curiosidad. Esperamos
We
que
hope that
Jackson
things continue to go well for Jackson and that the muses and their inspiration never fail him. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Gracias a usted.